Chapter 55. Flight. Inspector Bucket of the detective has not yet struck his great blow, as just now chronicled, but is yet refreshing himself with sleep preparatory to his field day, when, through the night and along the freezing wintry roads, a chastened pair comes out of Lincolnshire, making its way towards London. The railroads shall soon traverse all this country, and with a rattle and a glare the engine and train shall shoot like a meteor over the wide night landscape, turning the moon paler. But as yet such things are non-existent in these parts, though not wholly unexpected. Preparations are afoot, measurements are made, ground is staked out, bridges are begun, and their not yet united piers desolately look at one another over roads and streams like brick and mortar couples with an obstacle to their union. Fragments of embankments are thrown up and left as precipices, with torrents of rusty carts and barrows tumbling over them. Tripods of tall poles appear on hilltops where there are rumours of tunnels. Everything looks chaotic and abandoned in full hopelessness along the freezing roads, and through the night the post-chaise makes its way without a railroad on its mind. Mrs. Rouncewell, so many years housekeeper at Chesney Wold, sits within the chaise, and by her side sits Mrs. Bagnet with her grey cloak and umbrella. The old girl would prefer the bar in front, as being exposed to the weather, and a primitive sort of perch more in accordance with her usual course of travelling. But Mrs. Rouncewell is too thoughtful of her comfort to admit of her proposing it. The old lady cannot make enough of the old girl. She sits in her stately manner, holding her hand, and regardless of its roughness, puts it often to her lips. "You are a mother, my dear soul," she says many times, "and you've found out my George's mother." "Why, George," returns Mrs. Bagnet, "was always free with me, ma'am, and when he said at our house to my Woolwich that of all the things my Woolwich could have to think of when he grew to be a man, the comfortablest would be that he had never brought a sorrowful line into his mother's face, or turned a hair of her head grey. Then I felt sure from his way that something fresh had brought his own mother into his mind. I had often known him to say to me in past times that he had behaved bad to her." "Never, my dear," returns Mrs. Rouncewell, bursting into tears. "My blessing on him, never. He was always fond of me, and loving me, was my George. But he had a bold spirit, and he ran a little wild and went for a soldier. And I knew he waited at first, letting us know about himself, till he should rise to be an officer. And when he didn't rise, I know he considered himself beneath us, and it would be a disgrace to us, for he had a lion heart, had my George, always from a baby." The old lady's hands stray about her as of yore, while she recalls, all in a tremble, what a likely lad, what a fine lad, what a gay, good-humoured, clever lad he was. How they all took to him down at Chesney Wold. How Sir Leicester took to him when he was a young gentleman. How the dogs took to him. How even the people who had been angry with him forgave him the moment he was gone. Poor boy. And now to see him after all, and in prison too. The broad stomacher heaves, and the quaint, upright, old-fashioned figure bends under its load of affectionate distress. Mrs. Bagnet, with the instinctive skill of a good warm heart, leaves the old housekeeper to her emotions for a little while, not without passing the back of her hand across her own motherly eyes, and presently chirps up in her cheery manner, "So I says to George when I goes to call him to tea," he pretended to be smoking his pipe outside, "what ails you this afternoon, George, for gracious sake? I have seen all sorts, and I've seen you pretty often in season and out of season, abroad and at home. I never see you so melancholy and penitent." "Why, Mrs. Bagnet," says George, "it's because I am melancholy and penitent both this afternoon that you see me so." "What have you done, old fellow?" I says. "Why, Mrs. Bagnet," says George, shaking his head, "what have I done has been done this many a long year, and is best not tried to be undone now. If I ever want to get to heaven, it won't be for being a good son to a widowed mother. I say no more. Now, ma'am, when George says to me that it's best not tried to be undone now, I have my thoughts, as I have often had before, and I draw it out of George how he comes to have such things on him that afternoon. Then George tells me that he has seen by chance, at the lawyer's office, a fine old lady that has brought his mother plain before him, and he runs on about that old lady till he quite forgets himself, and paints her picture to me as she used to be, years upon years back. So I says to George, when he has done, 'Who is this old lady that is seen?' And George tells me it's Mrs. Rouncewell, housekeeper for more than half a century to the Dedlock family down at Chesney Wold in Lincolnshire. George has frequently told me that before that he's a Lincolnshire man, and I says to my old Lignum that night, 'Lignum, that's his mother for £45. All this Mrs. Bagnet now relates for the 20th time at least within the last 4 hours, trilling it out like a kind of bird, with a pretty high note, that it may be audible to the old lady above the hum of the wheels. "Bless you and thank you," says Mrs. Rouncewell. "Bless you and thank you, my worthy soul." "Dear heart," cries Mrs. Bagnet in the most natural manner, "no thanks to me, I'm sure. Thanks to yourself, ma'am, for being so ready to pay 'em. And mind once more, ma'am, what you had best do on finding George to be your own son is to make him, for your sake, have every sort of help put to himself in the right, and clear himself of a charge which he is as innocent as you or me. It won't do to have truth and justice on his side, he must have law and lawyers," exclaims the old girl, apparently persuaded that the latter form a separate establishment, and have dissolved partnership with truth and justice for ever and a day. "He shall have," says Mrs. Rouncewell, "all the help that can be got for him in the world, my dear. I will spend all I have, and thankfully, to procure it. Sir Leicester will do his best. The whole family will do their best. I know something, my dear, and I will make my own appeal as his mother, parted from him all these years, and finding him in gaol at last." The extreme disquietude of the old housekeeper's manner in saying this, her broken words, and a wringing of her hands, make a powerful impression on Mrs. Bagnet, and would astonish her but that she refers them all to her sorrow for her son's condition. And yet Mrs. Bagnet wonders too why Mrs. Rouncewell should murmur so distractedly, "My lady, my lady, my lady," over and over again. The frosty night wears away, and the dawn breaks, and the post chaise comes rolling on through the early mist like the ghost of a chaise departed. It has plenty of spectral company and ghosts of trees and hedges, slowly vanishing and giving place to the realities of day. London reached, the travellers alight, the old housekeeper in great tribulation and confusion, Mrs. Bagnet quite fresh and collected, as she would be if her next point, with no new equipage and outfit, were the Cape of Good Hope, the Island of Ascension, Hong Kong, or any other military station. But when they set out for the prison where the trooper is confined, the old lady has managed to draw about her, with her lavender-coloured dress, much of the staid calmness which is its usual accompaniment. A wonderfully grave, precise, and handsome piece of old china she looks, though her heart beats fast, and her stomach is ruffled more than ever the remembrance of this wayward son has ruffled it these many years. Approaching the cell, they find the door opening and a warder in the act of coming out. The old girl promptly makes a sign of entreaty to him to say nothing. Assenting with a nod, he suffers them to enter as he shuts the door. So George, who is writing at his table, supposing himself to be alone, does not raise his eyes, but remains absorbed. The old housekeeper looks at him, and those wandering hands of hers are quite enough for Mrs. Bagnet's confirmation. Even she could see the mother and the son together, knowing what she knows, and doubt their relationship. Not a rustle of the housekeeper's dress, nor a gesture, nor a word betrays her. She stands looking at him as he writes on, all unconscious, and only her fluttering hands give utterance to her emotions. But they are very eloquent, very, very eloquent. Mrs. Bagnet understands them. They speak of gratitude, of joy, of grief, of hope, of inextinguishable affection, cherished with no return since this stalwart man was a stripling, of a better son loved less, and this son loved so fondly and so proudly, and they speak in such touching language that Mrs. Bagnet's eyes brim up with tears, and they run glistening down her sun-browned face. "George Rouncewell, oh, my dear child, turn and look at me." The trooper stands up, clasps his mother round the neck, and falls down on his knees before her, whether in late repentance, whether in the first association that comes back upon him. He puts his hands together as a child does when it says its prayers, and raising them towards her breast, bows down his head and cries, "My George, my dearest son, always my favourite, and my favourite still. Where have you been these cruel years and years? Grown such a man too, grown such a fine strong man, grown so like what I knew he must be if he pleased God was alive." She can ask and he can answer. Nothing connected for a time. All that time the old girl turned away, leans one arm against the whitened wall, leans her honest forehead upon it, wipes her eyes with her serviceable grey cloak, and quite enjoys herself like the best of old girls as she is. "Mother," says the trooper when they are more composed, "forgive me first of all, for I know my need of it." Forgive him! She does it with all her heart and soul. She always has done it. She tells him how she has written it in her will these many years, that if he was her beloved son George, she has never believed ill of him. Never. If she had died without this happiness, and she's an old woman now, and can't look to live very long, she would have blessed him with her last breath, if she had her senses, as her beloved son George. Mother, I have been an undutiful trouble to you, and I have my reward. But of late years I have had a kind of glimmering of purpose in me too. When I left home I didn't care much, mother. I'm afraid not a great deal, for leaving, and went away and listed harum-scarum, but making believe to think that I cared for nobody. No, not I, and nobody cared for me. The trooper has dried his eyes and put away his handkerchief, but there is an extraordinary contrast between his habitual manner of expressing himself and carrying himself, and the softened tone in which he speaks, interrupted occasionally by a half-stifled sob. "So I wrote a line home, mother, as you too well know, to say I had listed under another name, and went abroad. Abroad at one time I thought I would write home next year, when I might be better off, and when that year was out I thought I would write home next year, when I might be better off, and when that year was out again, perhaps I didn't think much about it. So on from year to year, through a service of 10 years, till I began to get older and to ask myself, why should I ever write? I don't find any fault, child, not to ease my mind, George, not a word to your loving mother, who was growing older too." This almost overturns the trooper afresh, but he sets himself up with a great rough sounding clearance of his throat. "Heaven forgive me, mother, but I thought there would be small consolation then in hearing anything about me. There were you, respected and esteemed. There was my brother, as I had read in North Country papers now and then, rising to be prosperous and famous. There was I, a dragoon, roving, unsettled, not self-made like him, but self-unmade, all my earlier advantages thrown away, all my little learning unlearned, nothing picked up but what unfitted me for most things that I could think of. What business had I to make myself known? After letting all that time go by me, what good could come of it? The worst was past with you, mother. I knew by that time, being a man, how you had mourned for me, and wept for me, and prayed for me, and the pain was over, or it was softened down, and I was better in your mind as it was." The old lady sorrowfully shakes her head, and takes one of his powerful hands, lays it lovingly upon her shoulder. "No, don't say that it was so, mother, but that I had made it out to be so. I said just now what good could come of it. Well, my dear mother, some good might have come of it to myself. And there was the meanness of it. You would have sought me out. You would have purchased my discharge. You would have taken me down to Chesney Wold. You would have brought me and my brother's family together. You would have considered anxiously how to do something for me, and set me up as a respectable civilian. But how could any of you feel sure of me when I couldn't so much as feel sure of myself? How could you help regarding an encumbrance and a discredit to you, an idle dragooning chap who was an encumbrance and a discredit to himself, excepting under discipline? How could I look at my brother's children in the face and pretend to set them an example? I, the vagabond boy who had run away from home and been the grief and unhappiness of my mother's life. No, George, such were my words, mother, when I passed in this review before me. You have made your bed, now lie upon it." Mrs. Rouncewell, drawing up her stately forms, shakes her head at the old girl with a swelling pride upon her, as much as to say, "I told you so." The old girl relieves her feelings, and testifies her interest in the conversation by giving the trooper a great poke between the shoulders with her umbrella. This action she afterwards repeats at intervals in a species of affectionate lunacy, never failing, after the administration of each of these remonstrances, to resort to the whitened wall and the grey cloak again. This was the way that I brought myself to think, mother, that my best amends was to lie upon that bed I had made and die upon it. And I should have done it, though I have been to see you more than once down at Chesney Wold when you little thought of me, but for my old comrade's wife here, who I find has been too many for me, but I thank her for it. I thank you for it, Mrs. Bagnet, with all my heart and might." To which Mrs. Bagnet responds with 2 pokes. Now the old lady impresses upon her son George her own dear recovered boy, her joy and pride, the light of her eyes, the happy close of her life, and every fond name she can think of, that he must be governed by the best advice obtainable by money and influence, that he must yield up his case to the greatest lawyers that can be got, that he must act in this serious plight as he shall be advised to act, and must not be self-willed, however right, but must promise to think only of his poor old mother's anxiety and suffering until he is released, or he will break her heart. "Mother, 'tis little enough to consent to," returns the trooper, stopping her with a kiss. "Tell me what I shall do, and I'll make a late beginning and do it. Mrs. Bagnet, you'll take care of my mother, I know." A very hard poke from the old girl's umbrella. "You'll bring her acquainted with Mr. Jarndyce and Miss Summerson. She will find them of her way of thinking, and they will give her the best advice and assistance. And George," says the old lady, "we must send with all haste for your brother. He is a sensible sound man, as they tell me, out in the world beyond Chesney Wold, my dear, though I don't know much of it myself, and will be of great service." "Mother," returns the trooper, "is it too soon to ask a favour?" "Surely not, my dear." "Then grant me this one favour. Don't let my brother know." "Know what, my dear?" "Not know of me. In fact, mother, I can't bear it. I can't make up my mind to it. He has proved himself so different from me, and has done so much to raise himself, while I've been soldiering, that I haven't brass enough in my composition to see him in this place and under this charge. How could a man like him be expected to have any pleasure in such a discovery? It's impossible. No, keep my secret from him, mother. Do me a greater kindness than I deserve, and keep my secret from my brother, of all men." "But not always, dear George." "Why, mother, perhaps not for good and all, although I may come to ask that too. But keep it now, I do entreat you. If it's ever broke to him that his rip of a brother has turned up, I could wish," says the trooper, shaking his head very doubtfully, "to break it myself, and be governed as to advancing or retreating by the way in which he seems to take it." As he has evidently had a rooted feeling on this point, and as the depth of it is recognised in Mrs. Bagnet's face, his mother yields her implicit assent to what he asks. For this he thanks her kindly. "In all other respects, my dear mother, I'll be as tractable and obedient as you can wish. On this one alone I stand out. So now I am ready, even for the lawyers. I have been drawing up," he glances at the writing table, "an exact account of what I knew of the deceased, and how I came to be involved in this unfortunate affair. It is entered plain and regular like an orderly book, not a word in it but what's wanted for the facts. I did intend to read it straight on end, whatsoever I was called upon to say anything in my defence. I hope I may be let to do it still, but I have no longer a will of my own in this case, and whatever is said or done, I give my promise not to have any." Matters being brought to this so far satisfactory pass, and time being on the wane, Mrs. Bagnet proposes a departure. Again and again the old lady hangs upon her son's neck, and again the trooper holds her to his broad chest. "Where are you going to take my mother, Mrs. Bagnet?" "I am going to the town house, my dear, the family house. I have some business there that must be looked to directly," Mrs. Rouncewell answers. You'll see my mother safe there in the coach, Mrs. Bagnet? But of course I know you will. Why should I ask it? Why indeed? Mrs. Bagnet expresses with the umbrella. Take her, my old friend, and take my gratitude along with you. Kisses to Quebec and Malta, love to my godson, a hearty shake of the hand to Lignum, and this for yourself. And I wish it was £10,000 in gold, my dear. So saying, the trooper puts his lips to the old girl's tanned forehead, and the door shuts upon him in his cell. No entreaties on the part of the good old housekeeper will induce Mrs. Bagnet to retain the coach for her own conveyance home. Jumping out cheerfully at the door of the Dedlock mansion, and handing Mrs. Rouncewell up the steps, the old girl shakes hands and trudges off, arriving soon afterwards in the bosom of the Bagnet family, and falling to washing the greens as if nothing had happened. My lady is in that room in which she held her last conference with the murdered man, and is sitting where she sat that night, and is looking at the spot where he stood upon the hearth, studying her so leisurely, when a tap comes at the door. Who is it? Mrs. Rouncewell. What has brought Mrs. Rouncewell to town so unexpectedly? Trouble, my lady, sad trouble. Oh, my lady, may I beg a word with you? What new occurrence is it that makes this tranquil old woman tremble so? Far happier than her lady, as her lady has often thought. Why does she falter in this manner and look at her with such strange mistrust? What is the matter? Sit down and take your breath. Oh, my lady, I've found my son, my youngest, who went away for a soldier so long ago, and he is in prison. For debt? Oh, no, my lady, I would have paid any debt and joyful. For what is he in prison, then? Charged with murder, my lady, of which he is innocent as I am, accused of the murder of Mr. Tulkinghorn. What does she mean by this look and imploring gesture? Why does she come so close? What is the letter that she holds? Lady Dedlock, my dear lady, my good lady, my kind lady, you must have a heart to feel for me. You must have the heart to forgive me. I was in this family before you were born. I am devoted to it. But think of my dear son wrongfully accused. I do not accuse him. No, my lady, no, but others do, and he is in prison and in danger. Oh, Lady Dedlock, if you can say but a word to help to clear him, say it. What delusion can this be? What power does she suppose is in the person she petitions to avert this unjust suspicion, if it be unjust? Her lady's handsome eyes regard her with astonishment, almost with fear. My lady, I came away last night from Chesney Wold to find my son in my old age, and the step upon the Ghost's Walk was so constant and so solemn that I never heard the like in all these years. Night after night, as it has fallen dark, the sound has echoed through your rooms. But last night it was the awfullest, and as it fell dark last night, my lady, I got this letter. What letter is it? Hush, hush. The housekeeper looks round, and answers in a frightened whisper. My lady, I have not breathed a word of it. I don't believe what's written in it. I know it can't be true. I'm sure and certain that it is not true. But my son is in danger, and you must have a heart to pity me. If you know of anything that is not known to others, if you have any suspicion, if you have any clue at all, any reason for keeping it in your own breasts, oh, my dear lady, think of me, and conquer that reason, and let it be known. This is the most I consider possible. I know you are not a hard lady, but you go your own way, always without help, and you are not familiar with your friends, and all who admire you, and all do, as a beautiful and elegant lady, know you to be one far away from themselves, who can't be approached close. My lady, you may have some proud or angry reasons for disdaining to utter something that you know. If so, pray, oh pray, think of a faithful servant whose whole life has been passed in this family which she dearly loves, and relent, and help to clear my son, my lady, my good lady. The old housekeeper pleads with genuine simplicity. I am so humble in my place, and you are by nature so high and distant, that you may not think of what I feel for my child. But I feel so much that I have come here to make so bold as to beg and pray you not to be scornful of us, if you can do us any right or justice at this fearful time. Lady Dedlock raises her without one word, until she takes the letter from her hand. Am I to read this? When I am gone, my lady, if you please, and then remembering the most that I consider possible. I know of nothing I can do. I know of nothing I reserve that can affect your son. I have never accused him. My lady, you may pity him the more under a false accusation after reading the letter." The old housekeeper leaves her with the letter in her hand. In truth, she is not a hard lady, naturally, and the time has been when the sight of the venerable figure suing to her with such strong earnestness would have moved her to great compassion, but so long accustomed to suppress emotion and keep down reality, for so long schooled for her own purpose in that destructive school which shuts up the natural feelings of the heart like flies in amber, and spreads one uniform and dreary gloss over the good and bad, the feeling and the unfeeling, the sensible and the senseless, she had subdued even her wonder until now. She opens the letter. Spread out upon the paper is a printed account of the discovery of the body as it lay face downward on the floor, shot through the heart, and underneath is written her own name with the word "murderess" attached. It falls out of her hand. How long it may have lain upon the ground she knows not, but it lies where it fell, when a servant stands before her, announcing the young man by the name of Guppy. The words have probably been repeated several times, for they are ringing in her head before she begins to understand them. Let him come in. He comes in. Holding the letter in her hand, which she has taken from the floor, she tries to collect her thoughts. In the eyes of Mr. Guppy she is the same Lady Dedlock, holding the same prepared, proud, chilling state. "Your ladyship may not be at first disposed to excuse this visit from one who has never been welcome to your ladyship, which he don't complain of, for he is bound to confess there's never been any particular reason on the face of things why he should be. But I hope when I mention my motives to your ladyship you will not find fault with me," says Mr. Guppy. "Do so." "Thank your ladyship. I will first explain to your ladyship." Mr. Guppy sits on the edge of the chair, puts his hat on the carpet at his feet. "That Miss Summerson, whose image, as I formerly mentioned to your ladyship, was at one period of my life imprinted on my heart until erased by circumstances over which I had no control, communicated to me after I had the pleasure of waiting on your ladyship last, that she particularly wished me to take no steps whatever in any manner at all relating to her. Miss Summerson's wishes being me a law, except as connected with circumstances over which I have no control, I consequently never expected to have distinguished the honour of waiting on your ladyship again." "And yet here he is now," Lady Dedlock moodily reminds him. "And yet here I am now," Mr. Guppy admits, "my object being to communicate to your ladyship, under the seal of confidence, why I am here." He cannot do so, she tells him, too plainly or too briefly. "Nor can I," Mr. Guppy returns with a sense of injury upon him, "to particularly request your ladyship to take a particular notice that it's no personal affair of mine that brings me here. I have no interested views of my own to serve in coming here. If it was not for my promise to Miss Summerson, and my keeping it sacred, I, in point of fact, shouldn't have darkened these doors again, but should have seen them further first." Mr. Guppy considers this a favourable moment for sticking up his hair with both hands. "Your ladyship will remember when I mention it, that the last time I was here I ran against a party very eminent in our profession, and whose loss we all deplore. That party certainly did from time to time apply himself to cutting against me in a way that I would call sharp practice, and did make it at every turn and point extremely difficult for me to be sure that I hadn't inadvertently led up to something contrary to Miss Summerson's wishes. Self-praise is no recommendation, but I may say for myself that I'm not so bad a man of business either." Lady Dedlock looks at him in stern inquiry. Mr. Guppy immediately withdraws his eyes from her face and looks anywhere else. "Indeed, it has been made so hard," he goes on, "to have any idea what that party was up to in combination with others, that until the loss which we all deplore I was gravelled, an expression which your ladyship, moving in the higher circles, will be so good as to consider tantamount to knocked over. Small, likewise, a name by which I refer to another party, a friend of mine that your ladyship is not acquainted with, got to be so close and double-faced at that times it wasn't easy to keep one's hands off his head. However, what with the exertion of my humble abilities, and what with the help of a mutual friend by the name of Mr. Tony Weevil, who is of a high aristocratic turn, and has your ladyship's portrait always hanging up in his room, I now have reasons for an apprehension which I come to put to your ladyship upon your guard. First, will your ladyship allow me to ask whether you have had any strange visitors this morning? I don't mean fashionable visitors, but such visitors, for instance, as Miss Barbary's old servant, or as a person without the use of his lower extremities carried upstairs similarly to a guy. No. Then I assure your ladyship that such visitors have been here and have been received here, because I saw them at the door and waited at the corner of the square till they come out, and took half an hour's turn afterwards to avoid them. What have I to do with that, or what have you? I do not understand you. What do you mean? Your ladyship, I come to put you on your guard. There may be no occasion for it. Very well, then I have only done my best to keep my promise to Miss Summerson. I strongly suspect, from what Small has dropped, and from what we have corkscrewed out of him, that those letters I was to have brought to her ladyship were not destroyed when I suppose they were. That if there was anything to be blown upon, it is blown upon. That the visitors have alluded to have been here this morning to make money of it, and that money is the made or making. Mr. Guppy picks up his hat and rises. Your ladyship, you know best whether there's anything of what I can say, or whether there's nothing, something or nothing. I have acted up to Miss Summerson's wishes in letting things alone and undoing what I had begun to do as far as possible. That's sufficient for me. In case I should be taking a liberty in putting your ladyship on your guard, then there's no necessity for it. You will endeavour, I should hope, to outlive my presumption, and I shall endeavour to outlive your disapprobation. Now I take my farewell of your ladyship, and assure you there's no danger of your ever being waited on by me again. She scarcely acknowledges these parting words with any look, but when he has been gone a little while, she rings her bell. Where is Sir Leicester? Mercury reports that he is at present shut up in the library alone. Has Sir Leicester had any visitors this morning? Several on business. Mercury proceeds to a description of them, which has been anticipated by Mr. Guppy. Enough, he may go. So, all is broken down. Her name is in these many mouths. Her husband knows his wrongs. Her shame will be published, maybe spreading while she thinks about it. And in addition to the thunderbolt, so long foreseen by her, so unforeseen by him, she is denounced by an invisible accuser as the murderess of her enemy. Her enemy he was, and she has often, often, often wished him dead. Her enemy he is, even in his grave. This dreadful accusation comes upon her like a new torment at his lifeless hand. And when she recalls how she was secretly at his door that night, and how she may be represented to have sent her favourite girl away so soon before, merely to release herself from observation, she shudders as if the hangman's hands were at her neck. She has thrown herself upon the floor, and lies with her hair all wildly scattered, and her face buried in the cushions of a couch. She rises up, hurries to and fro, flings herself down again, and rocks and moans. The horror that is upon her is unutterable. If she really were the murderess, it could hardly be, for the moment, more intense. As for her murderous perspective before the doing of the deed, however subtle the precautions for its commission, would have been closed up by a gigantic dilation of the hateful figure, preventing her from seeing any consequences beyond it. And as those consequences would have rushed in an unimagined flood, the moment the figure was laid low, which always happens when a murder is done. Now she sees that when he used to be on the watch before her, she used to think, if some mortal stroke would but fall on this old man and take him from my way, it was but wishing that all he held against her in his hand might be flung to the winds and chance sown in many places. So too with the wicked relief she has felt in his death. What was his death but the keystone of a gloomy arch removed? And now the arch begins to fall in 1,000 fragments, each crushing and mangling piecemeal. Thus a terrible impression steals upon and overshadows her from this pursuer, living or dead, obdurate and imperturbable before her in his well-remembered shape, not more obdurate and imperturbable in his coffin bed. There is no escape but in death. Hunted she flies. The complication of her shame, her dread, remorse and misery overwhelms her at his height, and even her strength of self-reliance is overturned and whirled away like a leaf before a mighty wind. She hurriedly addresses these lines to her husband, seals and leaves them on her table. If I am sought for or accused of murder, believe that I am wholly innocent. Believe no other good of me, for I am innocent of nothing else that you have heard or will hear laid to my charge. He prepared me on that fatal night for his disclosure of my guilt to you. After he had left me, I went out on the pretence of walking in the garden where I sometimes walk, but really to follow him and make one last petition that he would not protract the dreadful suspense on which I have been racked by him. You do not know how long, but would mercifully strike next morning. I found his house dark and silent. I rang twice at his door, but there was no reply, and I came home. I have no home left. I will encumber you no more. May you, in your just resentment, be able to forget the unworthy woman on whom you have wasted a most generous devotion, who avoids you only with a deeper shame than that with which she hurries from herself, and who writes this last adieu. She veils and dresses quickly, leaves all her jewels and her money, listens downstairs at a moment when the hall is empty, opens and shuts the great door, flutters away in the shrill, frosty wind. Chapter 56. Pursuit. Impassive, as behoves its high breeding, the Dedlock town house stares at the other houses in the street of dismal grandeur, and gives no outward sign of anything going wrong within. Cartridges rattle, doors are battered at, the world exchanges calls, ancient charmers with skeleton throats and peachy cheeks that have rather ghastly bloom upon them seen by daylight, when indeed these fascinating creatures look like death and the lady fused together, dazzle the eyes of men. Forth from the frigid mews come easily swinging carriages, guided by short-legged coachmen in flaxen wigs, deep sunk into downy hammercloths, and up behind mount luscious Mercuries, bearing sticks of state and wearing cocked hats broadwise, a spectacle for the angels. The Dedlock town house changes not externally, and hours pass before its exalted dullness is disturbed within. But Bologna the fair, being subject to the prevalent complaint of boredom, and finding that disorder attacking her spirits with some virulence, ventures at length to repair to the library for a change of scene. Her gentle tapping at the door producing no response, she opens it and peeps in. Seeing no one there, takes possession. The sprightly Dedlock is reputed, in that grass-grown city of the ancients, Bath, to be stimulated by an urgent curiosity which impels her on all convenient and inconvenient occasions to sidle about with a golden glass at her eye, peering into objects of every description. Certain it is that she avails herself of the present opportunity of hovering over her kinsman's letters and papers like a bird, taking a short peck at this document, and a blink with her head on one side at that document, and hopping about from table to table with her glass at her eye in an inquisitive and restless manner. In the course of these researches she stumbles over something, and turning her glass in that direction, sees her kinsman lying on the ground like a felled tree. Volumnia's pet little scream acquires a considerable augmentation of reality from this surprise, and the house is quickly in commotion. Servants tear up and down stairs, bells are violently rung, doctors are sent for, and Lady Dedlock is sought in all directions, but not found. Nobody has seen or heard her since she last rang her bell. Her letter to Sir Leicester is discovered on her table, but it is doubtful yet whether he has not received another missive from another world, requiring to be personally answered, and all the living languages and all the dead are as one to him. They lay him down upon his bed, chafe and rub and fan and put ice to his head, and try every means of restoration. Howbeit the day has ebbed away, and it is night in his room before his stertorous breathing lulls or his fixed eyes show any consciousness of the candle that is occasionally passed before them. But when this change begins, it goes on, and by he nods or moves his eyes, or even his hand, in token that he hears and comprehends. He fell down this morning, a handsome, stately gentleman, somewhat infirm, but of fine presence, and with a well-filled face. He lies upon his bed, an aged man with sunken cheeks, the decrepit shadow of himself. His voice was rich and mellow, and he had so long been thoroughly persuaded of the weight and the import to mankind of any word he said, that his words really had come to sound as if there were something in them. But now he can only whisper, and what he whispers sounds like what it is, mere jumble and jargon. His favourite and faithful housekeeper stands at his bedside. It is the first act he notices, and he clearly derives pleasure from it. After vainly trying to make himself understood in speech, he makes the signs for a pencil, so inexpressively that they cannot first understand him. It is his old housekeeper who makes out what he wants and brings in a slate. After pausing for some time, he slowly scrawls upon it, in a hand that is not his, Chesney Wold. No, she tells him, he is in London. He was taken ill in the library this morning. Right thankful she is that she happened to come to London and is able to attend upon him. It's not an illness of any serious consequence, Sir Leicester. You will be much better tomorrow, Sir Leicester. All the gentlemen say so. This with the tears coursing down her fair old face. After making a survey of the room, and looking with particular attention all round the bed where the doctors stand, he writes, My lady. My lady went out, Sir Leicester, before you were taken ill, and don't know of your illness yet. He points again, in great agitation, at the two words. They all try to quiet him, but he points again with increased agitation. On their looking at one another, not knowing what to say, he takes the slate once more and writes, My lady, for God's sake, where? And makes an imploring moan. It is thought better that this old housekeeper should give him Lady Dedlock's letter, the contents of which no one knows or can surmise. She opens it for him and puts it out for his perusal. Having read it twice by a great effort, he turns it down so that it shall not be seen, and lies moaning. He passes into a kind of relapse or into a swoon, and it is an hour before he opens his eyes, reclining on his faithful and attached old servant's arm. The doctors know that he is best with her, and when not actively engaged about him, stand aloof. The slate comes into requisition again, but the word he wants to write he cannot remember. His anxiety, his eagerness and affliction at this pass are pitiable to behold. It seems as if he must go mad in the necessity he feels for haste, and the inability under which he labours of expressing it to do what, or to fetch whom. He has written the letter B and there stopped. Of a sudden, in the height of his misery, he puts Mr. before it. The old housekeeper suggests Bucket. Thank heaven, that is his meaning. Mr. Bucket is found to be downstairs by appointment. Shall he come up? There is no possibility of misconstruing Sir Leicester's burning wish to see him, or the desire he signifies to have the room cleared of every one but the housekeeper. It is speedily done. Mr. Bucket appears. Of all men upon earth, Sir Leicester seems to have fallen from his high estate to place his sole trust and reliance upon this man. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I'm sorry to see you like this. I hope you'll cheer up. I'm sure you will, on account of the family credit. Sir Leicester puts her letter in his hands and looks intently in his face while he reads it. A new intelligence comes into Mr. Bucket's eye as he reads on. With one hook of his finger, while that eye is still glancing over the words, he indicates, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I understand you. Sir Leicester writes upon the slate, Full forgiveness. Find. Mr. Bucket stops his hand. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I'll find her. My search after her must be begun out of hand. Not a minute must be lost. With a quickness of thought he follows Sir Leicester Dedlock's look towards a little box upon a table. Bring it here, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. Certainly. Open it with one of these keys. Certainly. The littlest key, to be sure. Take the notes out. So I will. Count 'em. That's soon done. 20 and 30's 50, and 20's 70, and 50's 120, and 40's 160. Take 'em for expenses. That I'll do, and render an account, of course. Don't spare money? No, I won't. The velocity and certainty of Mr. Bucket's interpretation on all these heads is little short of miraculous. Mrs. Rouncewell, who holds the light, is giddy with the swiftness of his eyes and hands as he starts up, furnished for his journey. "You're George's mother, old lady. That's about what you are, I believe," says Mr. Bucket aside, with his hat already on and buttoning his coat. "Yes, sir, I am his distressed mother. So I thought, according to what he mentioned to me just now." "Well, then, I'll tell you something. You needn't be distressed no more. Your son's all right. Now don't you begin a crying, because what you've got to do is take care of Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, and you won't do that by crying. As to your son, he's all right, I tell you, and he sends his loving duty, and hoping you're the same. He's discharged honourable, that's about what he is, with no more imputation on his character than there is on yours, and yours is a tidy one, I'll be bound. You may trust me, for I took to your son. He conducted himself in a game way too, on that occasion, and he's a fine man, and you're a fine made old lady, and you're a mother and a son, a pair of you as might be showed for models in a caravan. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, what you trusted to me, I'll go through with. Don't you be afraid of my turning out of my way, right or left, or taking a sleep, or a wash, or a shave, till I have found what I go in search of. Say everything is kind and forgiving on your part, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. I will, and I wish you better and these family affairs smoothed over, as Lord many other families equally has been, and equally will be, to the end of time." With this peroration, Mr. Bucket buttoned up and goes quietly out, looking steadily before him, as if he were already piercing the night in quest of the fugitive. His first step is to take himself to Lady Dedlock's rooms, and look all over them for any trifling indication that may help him. The rooms are in darkness now, and to see Mr. Bucket with a wax light in his hand, holding it above his head, and taking a sharp mental inventory of the many delicate objects so curiously at variance with himself, would be to see a sight which nobody does see, as he is particular to lock himself in. "A spicy boudoir this," says Mr. Bucket, who feels in a manner furbished up in his French by the blow of the morning. "Must have cost a sight of money. Rum articles to cut away from these. She must have been hard put to it." Opening and shutting table drawers, and looking into caskets and jewel cases, he sees the reflection of himself in various mirrors, and moralizes thereon. "One might suppose I was a moving in the fashionable circles and getting myself up for Almack's," says Mr. Bucket. "I begin to think I must be a swell in the Guards without knowing it." Ever looking about, he has opened a dainty little chest in an inner drawer, his great hand turning over some gloves which it can scarcely feel, they are so light and soft within it. Comes upon a white handkerchief. Let's have a look at you," says Mr. Bucket, putting down the light. "What should you be kept by yourself for? What's your motive? Are you her ladyship's property or somebody else's? You've got a mark upon you somewheres or another, I suppose." He finds it as he speaks. Esther Summerson. "Oh," says Mr. Bucket, pausing with his finger at his ear. "Come, I'll take you." He completes his observations as quietly and carefully as he has carried them on, leaves everything precisely as he found it, glides away after some 5 minutes in all, and passes into the street. With a glance upward at the dimly lighted windows of Sir Leicester's room, he sets off full swing to the nearest coach stand, picks out the horse for his money, and directs to be driven to the shooting gallery. Mr. Bucket does not claim to be a scientific judge of horses, but he lays out a little money on the principal events in that line, and generally sums up his knowledge of the subject in the remark that when he sees a horse as can go, he knows him. His knowledge is not at fault in the present instance. Clattering over the stones at a dangerous pace, yet thoughtfully bringing his keen eyes to bear on every slinking creature whom he passes in the midnight streets, and even on the lights in upper windows where people are going or gone to bed, and on all the turnings that he rattles by, and alike on the heavy sky and on the earth where the snow lies thin, for something may present itself to assist him anywhere. He dashes to his destination at such a speed that when he stops the horse half smothers him in a cloud of steam. "Unbear him half a moment to freshen him up, and I'll be back." He runs up the long wooden entry and finds the trooper smoking his pipe. I thought I should, George, after what you have gone through, my lad. I haven't a word to spare. Now, honour all to save a woman. Miss Summerson that was here when Gridley died. That was the name, I know. All right. Where does she live? The trooper has just come from there and gives him the address near Oxford Street. You won't repent it, George. Good night. He's off again, with an impression of having seen Phil sitting by the frosty fire, staring at him open mouthed, and gallops away again, and gets out in a cloud of steam again. Mr. Jarndyce, the only person up in the house, is just going to bed, rises from his book on hearing the rapid ringing at the bell, comes down to the door in his dressing gown. Don't be alarmed, sir. In a moment his visitor is confidential with him in the hall, has shut the door, and stands with his hand upon the lock. I've had the pleasure of seeing you before, Inspector Bucket. Look at that handkerchief, sir. Miss Esther Summerson's. Found it myself, put away in a drawer of Lady Dedlock's quarter of an hour ago. Matter of life or death. You know Lady Dedlock? Yes. There's been a discovery there today. Family affairs have come out. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, has had a fit, apoplexy or paralysis, and couldn't be brought to. Precious time has been lost. Lady Dedlock disappeared this afternoon, and has left a letter for him that looks bad. Run your eye over it. Here it is. Mr. Jarndyce, having read it, asks him what he thinks. I don't know. It looks like suicide. Anyways, there's more and more danger every minute of it drawing to that. I'd give £100 an hour to have got the start at the present time, Mr. Jarndyce. I am employed by Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, to follow her and find her, to save her and take her his forgiveness. I have money and full power, but I want something else. I want Miss Summerson. Mr. Jarndyce, in a troubled voice, repeats, Miss Summerson? Now, Mr. Jarndyce, Mr. Bucket has read his face with the greatest attention all along. I speak to you as a gentleman of a humane heart, and under such pressing circumstances it don't often happen. If ever a delay was dangerous, it's dangerous now, and if ever you couldn't afterwards forgive yourself for causing it, this is the time. 8 or 10 hours' worth, as I tell you, £100 apiece at least, have been lost since Lady Dedlock disappeared. I am charged to find her. I am Inspector Bucket. Besides all the rest that's heavy on her, she has upon her, as she believes, the suspicion of murder. If I follow her alone, she being in ignorance of what Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, has communicated to me, may be driven to desperation. But if I follow her in company with a young lady, answering to the description of a young lady that she has a tenderness for, I ask no question, and I say no more than that. She will give me credit for being friendly. Let me come up with her, and be able to have the hold upon her of putting that young lady forward, and I'll save her and prevail with her if she is alive. Let me come up with her alone, a hard matter, and I'll do my best, but I don't answer for what the best may be. Time flies. It's getting on for 1 o'clock. When one strikes, there's another hour gone. It's worth £1,000 now instead of 100. This is all true, and the pressing nature of the case cannot be questioned. Mr. Jarndyce begs him to remain there while he speaks to Miss Summerson. Mr. Bucket says he will, but acting upon his usual principle, does no such thing, following upstairs instead and keeping his man in sight. So he remains, dodging and lurking about in the gloom of the staircase while they confer. In a very little time Mr. Jarndyce comes down and tells him that Miss Summerson will join him directly, and place himself under his protection to accompany him where he pleases. Mr. Bucket, satisfied, expresses high approval, and awaits her coming at the door. There he mounts a high tower in his mind, and looks out far and wide. Many solitary figures he perceives creeping through the streets, many solitary figures on heaths and roads lying under haystacks, but the figure that he seeks is not among them. Other solitaries he perceives in nooks of bridges, looking over, and in shadowed places down by the river's level. And a dark, dark, shapeless object, drifting with the tide, more solitary than all, clings with a drowning hold on his attention. Where is she? Living or dead, where is she? If, as he folds the handkerchief and carefully puts it up, it were able with an enchanted power to bring before him the place where she found it, And the night landscape near the cottage where it covered the little child, would he descry her there? On the waste where the brick kilns are burning with a pale blue flare, where the straw roofs of the wretched huts in which the bricks are made are being scattered by the wind, where the clay and water are hard frozen, and the mill in which the gaunt blind horse goes round all day looks like an instrument of human torture. Traversing this deserted, blighted spot, there is a lonely figure with a sad world to itself, pelted by the snow and driven by the wind, and cast out, it would seem, from all companionship. It is the figure of a woman too, but it is miserably dressed, and no such clothes ever came through the hall and out at the great door of the Dedlock mansion.